Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening on yet another engaging and stimulating lecture. We've had a fantastic lineup this semester, and I know that this evening's lecture will top it all. And I'm really very pleased that Professor Sameh Hanna could join us. This has been in the making. We've tried to plan it when we were normal and face-to-face, but we could never get the dates straight because he's in the UK and you know, we have different vacation schedules in our respective universities. And finally, Corona came around and we could actually grab him and have him with us online. Much to my chagrin and everybody else's, that he can't be here with us in person, but I hope that we will be able to host him in person very soon after this global crisis that we are all witnessing. Professor Hanna completed his PhD in the Sociology of Translation at the University of Manchester in 2006. He joined University College London as an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow, contributing research and teaching in postgraduate programs in translation studies. He later obtained lectureships at the universities of Salford and Leeds. In Leeds, he was the director of Arabic, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies until 2020. Currently, he is a Bible translation consultant with United Bible Societies, a research fellow at the University of Leeds, and a visiting faculty at the NIDA School of Translation Studies. Professor Hanna is a founding member of the International Association for Translation and Intercultural Studies, IATIS, and he co-edited its journal that is titled New Voices in Translation Studies for a number of years. Recently, Professor Hanna has assumed an associate editorship of the academic journal Target. In addition to a number of journal articles, chapters in edited volumes, he published his monograph Bourdieu in Translation Studies, The Dynamics of Shakespeare Translation in Egypt. This was published in 2016, and he also co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Arabic Translation in 2020. That was published, obviously, by Routledge. Currently, Professor Hanna is writing a monograph on the social history of Bible translation in Arabic, and I'm certain this is going to be a major work. Today's lecture is titled Sociology of Translation, Shakespeare in Arabic, and the title itself, as you can see, brings together multiple fields of knowledge and attests to the interdisciplinarity of the field of translation studies and how it has been able to draw on other disciplines in order to develop itself over time. Professor Hanna's presentation, we expect, is going to challenge a long-standing narrative about the history of the Arabic translations of Shakespeare's dramatic works in particular. Using Pierre Bourdieu's sociology of cultural production and field theory, Professor Hanna's presentation will call into question a linear and unicausal understanding of the history of the Arabic translations of Shakespeare's work. He's obviously taking on two major figures and vast amount of material, and I personally am really looking forward to your lecture, and thank you for accepting our invitation. We are delighted to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehris, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And I do remember we have been trying to plan for this ages ago, and now it is a reality. Thanks to Corona. That's one of the blessings of Corona, that we can get together virtually and and talk about the things we like. Before I start, just one word about the format. Before I talk about the format, actually, I would like to thank you, Samia, for something else, not only about the invitation, but about what you and your team actually are doing in CTS, the Center for Transition Studies. A few minutes ago, before the start of the presentation, I was looking at the YouTube channel, and just to see the wide range of discussions and talks and presentations by scholars coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, to see all of that and to see the audience engaging and raising questions about translation, for me, this is really encouraging. Because one thing that I have been dreaming to achieve for a long time is to bring discussion around translation to the general public, and engage people and trying to challenge their own ways of thinking about how translation happens and how it can be studied. I think you have been able to do that to a large extent in your center. So my congratulations. About the format of my presentation, just a few words. I know that it is quite hard to engage people virtually, so I will be sharing thoughts and ideas about slides that I will be sharing with you now. But I will read two brief sections at the very beginning and at the very end. And in between, most of the time will be spent talking about case studies, looking at specific translations of Shakespeare's work in Arabic in Egypt. So let me try to share my screen, hoping that technology serves us well. And please let me know if you can see the slides, and put that on display mode. Can you all see that?
Yes, Doctor, we can see.
That's the presenter's mode. Yeah. Right, just one or two words about the title, and again, it's important to make that clear. I myself was divided about which title to choose for the presentation. The advertised title is Sociology of Translation, and I found out after this was advertised that more accurately it should be called A Sociology of Translation. Because at the time we're talking about different sociological approaches that have been developed since the 1990s, using the work of some other sociologists apart from Bourdieu, people like Bruno Latour, and there is a wide range of scholarship on actor network theory, trying to use the language and the meta vocabulary developed by Bruno Latour to study translation. My focus today will be only on Bourdieu's work. How can we make sense of Bourdieu's conceptual tools to facilitate a conversation between Shakespeare's work and Egyptian theater, or the field of translating drama in Egypt. But when I talk about sociology of translation, as we'll see, my focus will be on the historical aspect of these sociological analysis. According to Bourdieu, it's quite hard to separate sociology from history. Sociology is always historically conditioned. Sociological analysis always happens in time. It's framed at a specific point in time. So when I say a sociological analysis of Shakespeare in Egypt, actually I'm talking about the social history of Shakespeare translation in Egypt. And when I say history, just to alert you, I'm not going to cover every single translation that has been produced in Egypt of Shakespeare's work. That's hard work. We cannot do that in 1 hour. I will just focus on a couple of cases, especially cases that come from the first 2 generations of translators of Shakespeare's work into Arabic. One translation of Hamlet and another of Othello. And the whole purpose is to share with you a way of thinking about translation, a way of reasoning translation, a way of describing them and analyzing them and understanding why they happen in that or this way. So I will not be talking about how to do translation of Shakespeare, but how we can read a Shakespeare translation into Arabic. So having said that, let me move and I'll read a couple of paragraphs that has to do with the picture of this person that you see in front of you. While I was compiling case studies for my research project on the sociology of the Arabic translations of Shakespeare's tragedies in Egypt, I came across a photograph of one of the earliest translators of Shakespeare in Egypt, and the first to translate Hamlet into Arabic. That was in 1901. In the photograph, which was published in the only poetry anthology he left, Tanius Abdu poses for the camera with a serious look, eyes slightly diverted from the viewer, and without the pensive hand-on-chin pose, which later came to be associated with established and canonized authors. At the bottom of the photo and in Arabic mono-rhyming verse, Abdu sarcastically addresses the readers of his poetry and translation, saying, هذه صورتي تراها فقل ما شئت فيها فإنها لا تراك. لا يراك انقباض وجهي فقد كان بشوشا من قبل أن يلقاك. إنما أدركته حرفة قوم. I like this expression, حرفة قوم. كتب الله أن يكونوا كذاك. Which roughly translates as follows. What you see is my picture, say whatever you want about it, it does not see you. Do not bother about my upset face. It has been happier before it saw you. The person with this face only joined a profession where people are destined to be just like that. To develop a sociology of Shakespeare translation in Egypt is to capture the dynamics of this profession, which make people like Tanius Abdu look just like that. In other words, this sociology is only possible when the still picture of Tanius Abdu is made to speak, when the diverted eyes of the translator are made to look straight into the eyes of the sociologist or the social historian in my case, and respond to questions about translatorial agency, translation practices, and decisions, which are all socially and historically conditioned. However, this agency can only be reconstructed when the personal and the collective histories of that translator, which are embodied in the habitus, I'm using one of Bourdieu's terms, I'll get to it later. All of these histories, personal and collective, are embodied in the habitus of Tanius Abdu. When all of that are taken out of the still picture and reactivated in the socio-cultural space, where and when the translator functioned and produced translation. It is through the interplay of the individual translator's agency and their fields of activity, what Abdu calls in these lines of verse, the profession, that the Arabic translations of Shakespeare's dramatic work can be accounted for sociologically, and the social history of Shakespeare's work in Arabic can be written. And this is what I will be trying to do with you today. I'll get to this case in detail later, but before I talk about his translation, Tanius Abdu, I would like to share a few assumptions about the sociological analysis of translation. What are the assumptions that motivate the whole endeavor of reading translation sociologically or rewriting the history of translation from a sociological point of view? A few assumptions. First one, translation is not merely a response to a linguistic stimulus, that is the source text. And this is usually the kind of narrative which I call the linear narrative, which has been dominant in the field for a long time. We're talking about translation as a response to one stimulus, which is the source text. Translation responds to socio-cultural and political discourses in the host culture. Translation is mediated and shaped by multiple agents. For a long time, we use that the translator is the only agent, the only person who is in control of the end product of translation, who is the one who shapes and frames and makes all the decisions. Sociologically, this is not the case. There are multiple agents who intervene and contribute to the fashioning of the final product of translation. People like publishers, preface writers, front cover designers. The paratextual framing of translation is absolutely important in understanding this idea of multiple agency. Another assumption: translation agents are active in a social space, a field, where success is guaranteed by the forms of capital they accumulate through translation. So there is a struggle. People do not translate without the aim of achieving something, without trying to do something in the profession, without trying to say something new or challenging old ideas that exist in the field. And that field is always in a state of flux because of conflicts between agents over the legitimate form of capital. I'll talk about that later, the forms of capital in the field. The translation field and its agents can be reconstructed through the translation text and paratext. These are the two key tools that any social historian or sociologist can make use of to redeem and reconstruct these cases. Basically, what I'm trying to present you in place of the linear narrative is what I would call a relational narrative. So instead of talking about translation as the outcome of one linear relationship between source and target text, we want to talk about translation as the outcome of multiple relationships. The relationship with the source text is just one of them. Now let's go back to our friend Tanyus Abdo. Let's have a look at his translation. This is one key paratext of his work, which is the front cover. And of course, one way that helps the social historian of translation to reconstruct the field of translation and the agents in that field is the kind of language translators use to talk about their own work. And the best place of finding this language is the paratextual framing of translation. Front covers, back covers, blurbs, introductions, prefaces, footnotes, and so on and so forth. So this is what we have. This is the second edition of this translation. It was finished in 1901, and it was commissioned. We'll talk about that later by Sheikh Sameh Hijazi at the time for the stage. So it was done for the stage first, 1901, and after its success, it was published 1 year later in 1902. And this is what we have. And for the convenience of those of us who don't read Arabic, this is the gloss of the front cover. And it's quite interesting to see that at that time, translators still talked about theater using one word, which was at the time used to denote and refer to another genre, the word riwaya. People usually talked about riwayat al-tamthiliyya. And even before that, if you trace the kind of lexical items, the vocabulary that Egyptians at that time tried to develop to make sense of that new genre. And I don't want to get into that discussion about whether or not Arabs knew theater. Of course, Arabs knew theater or some elements of theater, and we can talk about khayal al-zill and shadow play that go back to the medieval ages. But theater in its Western sense, its Western definition as we know it, probably it was introduced for the first time in mid-19th century through the work of these translators. So using the word for a genre, which is already known for intellectuals and for consumers of culture at the time, which is riwaya, makes sense, but also raises a number of questions about how translators perceive this genre at the time. And even before that, there is a whole article, I wrote an article about that. Before that time, if you go back to the time of Al-Jabarti, historically the first encounter we know of between an Arab or an Egyptian in this case and theater. We can see that in Jabarti when he went to see one of these plays in Al-Azbakiya, one of these French plays brought by the French expedition. And the way he talked about it, when you look at the language, for example, he didn't even use the word riwaya. And the word he used to talk about theater and plays is اللعبة والألعاب. كنت أشاهد واحدة من هذه الألعاب لعبة. And the lexical entry لعب has a lot in it that explains how Arabs and Egyptians made sense of this new genre. So that's one word that attracts my attention, الرواية التمثيلية, الرواية. You can see also on the front cover a text for acting in 5 acts. The translator was aware that this is for acting, but also the way he perceived Shakespeare himself. He didn't see him as a dramatist or a playwright, but he talked about him and many others after him as a شاعر الإنجليزي الشهير, English poet. The way he talks about himself, about his own agency, is quite interesting when he describes himself as al-katib, the writer, the skilled writer. He's not a naqil, he's not a mutarjim, but he is a writer, a katib. And then he talks about some other capital that he has to his name, which is owning a newspaper and so on and so forth. I'll move forward. We managed to publish a 3rd edition of this play back in 2005 in a wonderful series published by the then المشروع القومي للترجمة, and the series was called ميراث الترجمة. And when you look at the history of this translation and its reception, you'll find the following. This was the only Arabic stage version of Hamlet for over 15 years. No translator dared to challenge or displace this version for almost 15 years. That's telling in itself. In its published form, it went into 2 different editions. But the way academics, the way historians of theater, generally speaking, made sense of Tanius Abdu and his generation is totally different. They didn't look at this kind of success, but they evaluated translation on their own terms. So this is one key quote coming from Muhammad Yusuf Nigm from his well-known book تاريخ المسرح في الأدب العربي, where he talks about Tanius Abdu in these terms. He doesn't say much about him, but when he talks about him and his output, the language is quite evaluative. And this is what he says. The undeniable fact is that the translator availed himself of all the means of distortion, which he brought to his translation. The translator pioneered the school known for deformation and distortion in translation practice. No story or play he translated was left unchanged. So for his generation, we're talking about the 1950s here, for his generation, Tanius Abdu was the icon of the traitor translator. If you want to give an example of a translator who really distorted the source text he was trying to render into Arabic, Tanius Abdu was the example. Perhaps you might agree with Nigm if you look at the actual translation. What is really happening in this case? A number of things. So first of all, the storyline has been radically changed. We don't have the narrative, the story, the plot structure as we know it from Shakespeare's tragedy. One example is how the play ends. We all know how Hamlet ends. But that was not the case for Tanius Abdu. The play doesn't have that bloody ending we all know about. All of the key characters in the play are dead. Hamlet himself is dead. Ophelia is dead. But we have a different ending in Abdu's translation. Hamlet is kept alive. The ghost of his father shows on stage. And he says these words to him. He restores justice to him. He gives him the throne back. And this is what he says to him. وَأَنْتَ تعش سعيدا على الأرض مغفورا لك في السماء فاصعد أمامي إلى مقام عمك فما خلق إلا لأجلك هذا العرش. هاملت يصعد درجات العرش ناظرا إلى أبيه نظرة إعجاب والخيال the ghost ينزل تباعا في جوف الأرض إلى آخر الكلام. Some theater companies have taken this version and they have created other endings. They have added other endings to this scripted ending, if you like. So some of these endings would have not only Hamlet alive, but they would keep Ophelia alive. They would marry them to each other in a typically Egyptian marriage ceremony with belly dancing and singing. So the whole plot structure has been radically changed. But not only that, the genre of this Shakespearean tragedy has also been changed. And you can easily find that out by looking at any excerpts of Abdu's translations of the monologues, Shakespeare's soliloquies. We all know that Shakespeare used these monologues to heighten and underline that dramatic tension between public self and private self. And this is echoed in the kind of language used in Shakespeare's monologues. The language is incomplete, have a lot of distorted sentences, a lot of pauses, exclamation marks, questions, and all sorts of linguistic techniques that shows that the speaker in these monologues is not in control of the discourse. But what we have in the translation is totally different. We have versified, declamatory language with a rhyme scheme, complete sentences, and the language sounded as if it was lyrics for songs. And perhaps it's not surprising to know that the person who played Hamlet for this version was Sameh Hanna himself. And maybe he was so keen to make the monologues places where he can invest in his own singing talents. So the genre has gone. And this is just one example, to be or not to be, the well-known soliloquy by Hamlet here. This is the kind of language that you can see in these monologues. فناء بعد موتك أم خلود وهل عدم مصيرك أم وجود وما هذا الوجود إلا انتباه يؤمل فيه إن طال الرقود وما يختار أهل الرشد لما يضل بيأسه العقل الرشيد, and so on and so forth. So that's a kind of nasheed, that's a kind of lyrics for singing, not a monologue, not the typical Shakespearean monologue as we know of. Right, so all of these examples, if you see them, you might actually agree with Dr. Nigm. Actually, many other historians of Arabic theater tended to agree with him. This is just one other quotation from a piece of work, a bibliography of Shakespeare's work in Arabic by Dr. Mahmoud al-Shittawi, published back in 2000. And with that bibliography, he made that comment on Abdu's work. Abdu's translation of Hamlet is considered an awkward translation, evaluated language, marked by such deviations. The kind of language used is very interesting, deviations from the point of reference, which is the source text, from the source text, that it ends up offering only a ghostly resemblance of the original. We're not presented with the reality of who Shakespeare is and what his text is, but all we have is a ghostly resemblance. Now, I want to challenge that. I have been spending the last decade of my career trying to challenge this kind of reading, this kind of writing the history of translation. And all I was trying to do is to redeem Tanius Abdu and many other translators from later generations. And by redeeming them, I simply try to reconstruct the whole field of activity. The whole assumption, as I have mentioned earlier, is that we cannot make sense of the agency of these people, why they did what they did, without locating them back into the field, which gave rise to their own decisions and translation strategies. And now we're approaching, we're getting close to Bourdieu now, the person who I believe helped me in reading this history differently. One key challenge about Bourdieu's prose, apart from the fact that it is quite dense and difficult to make sense of, is the fact that he keeps defining his key terms all the time, and it's quite hard to find one definition of what a field is in one place of his writings. You need to consult different locations of his work in order to arrive at a definition of field. That's an exception. These few lines from Sociology in question is an exception, really, where we can see all of the key elements of a field, that thing that we need to reconstruct to make sense of Abdu's work. So this is what Bourdieu says. We know that in every field, we shall find a struggle between different agents, conflict over capital, over winning, over occupying the dominant position in a field, the specific forms of which have to be looked for each time. These forms of struggle and these forms of capital keep mutating between the newcomer who tries to break through the entry barriers and the dominant agent who will try to defend the monopoly and keep out competition. In other words, it's a struggle between those who try to maintain the status quo of translation and the new generations who try to challenge the status quo and push in its place a pro-quo, a new reality, a new way of doing it. If I am to visualize Bourdieu's ideas about field, which in this case I will run the risk of simplification, but in the 1 hour lecture, we can't afford to talk about every single dimension of Bourdieu's understanding of field. I will project it visually like this. So what we have in front of us is an outer context, is a bigger context, which he calls the social space, and by that he means the society at large. The society with all it involves, social structure, the kind of discourses in circulation in that society, the kind of dynamics between different social classes and so on and so forth. These social space shapes and exercises some impact on any cultural activity, including translation. And within that bigger space, we have a more specialized and narrower space, using the word of Abdu, that profession, if you like. Profession is a social space that has its own rules, that has its own boundaries, that has its own codes of membership. People are allowed to enter into that space, into this profession on specific terms. And these terms are changed every now and then due to that conflict and the struggle between different agents. And these comers, these agents in the field can be individuals and can be institutions. The players in the field are not necessarily individual persons, but institutions in the form of centers, in the form of academic institutions, in the form of transition projects, national transition projects, which have their own funding and their own guidelines of translating and so on and so forth. So these are all different agents. Now, something very important that I would like to draw your attention to in this diagram is the arrow coming. There are two arrows. One of them is coming from the direction of the outer space, the social space, into the field. But if you can see that the arrow does not remain straight into the field. And this is one key concept that really helped me to understand what it means to do sociology of translation. And that's the concept of refraction. And Bourdieu used that to counter and to challenge another concept which was at his time, we're talking about 1950s, 1960s, in French academia, where notions like reflection in the Marxist sense were so much in vogue, were so much dominant. So people talk about literature as a reflection of, as a direct reflection, direct mechanical reflection of discourses in society. What Bourdieu is telling us here is that, of course, the society does have some impact on how we produce and consume translation, but this impact is not mechanical, is not direct. This impact, when it gets into the field, it changes its direction. It takes different forms. It becomes subject to new dynamics, the dynamics of the profession. So we still have some impact, but this impact is changed. Something else in Bourdieu's sociology that helps us to redeem people like Tanios Abdo and read them and their work differently is what Bourdieu talks about as the homologous relationship between different fields. Or in other words, the interface, the synergy, if you like, between the field we are trying to study or reconstruct and some other fields of activity. And practically this makes sense. No one of these translators, no translator nowadays, especially in the Arab world, they can't afford to live on translation alone. They need to work in some other fields of activity. They need to engage in some other work, doing journalism, being academics, teaching foreign languages, and so on and so forth. And this is what we see in somebody like Tanios Abdo and many others. These people traveled and moved across boundaries of fields. Some of them moved from the field of theater into the field of drama translation. Some of them moved from the field of pop culture, somebody like Sameh Hanna. He comes from the background of pop culture, singing, entertaining people. When he enters into theater and drama translation, he brings some of the influence of that field into the field of drama translation. And we see that from history. We know that he used to tell Tanios Abdo about places in the translation where he wanted to see some space for singing, for singing out loud these monologues with music. So the homology between the field we are trying to reconstruct and some other fields is fundamental in our understanding of how translation works in any given field. Right, so what is it that we are trying to reconstruct? The structure of the field, who is in the field, and what kind of capital, what is at stake in the fields, what are people struggling over. And by the way, what people are struggling over can change from one time to the other. And the form of struggle defines for translators the meaning of a successful translation. So people keep all the time talking about the criteria for an acceptable, successful translation. One group would say that, well, a successful translation is the one that sells. Tell me about the number of tickets that people bought to go and see Tanios Abdo's version performed by Sameh Hanna, and I would tell you how successful this translation is. Other groups of translators would say, no, this is not the case. The criteria of success here is how close the translation to Shakespeare's text, or to what we understand to be Shakespeare's text. So even the forms of struggle keep mutating over time. So we need to reconstruct the structure, and we need to reconstruct the dynamics, what forms of struggle. And we also need to reconstruct the homology, the synergy with other fields of activity. A few words about the structure of the field. A few of these ideas I've already mentioned. One word that I keep trying to avoid using, which is kind of confusing, and that's the concept of habitus. And this is the concept that Bourdieu uses to talk about the agency of any particular producer of culture, whether this producer was a translator, or a writer, or a sculptor, or a painter, or anything. He uses that word, and for him, and for me, that's a very useful concept to try to bridge the gap between what people in sociology and philosophy have been talking about as the tension between subject and object, the researcher and what is being researched, the individual and the objective structures surrounding the individual. For him, this dichotomy does not exist. The agency of any one individual has in it, has written in it some of the codes of the objective structures, some of the codes which have been approved in the field. So the individual translator is not totally free to do what they want. They have in that habitus, almost unconsciously, there are things they do in translation they are not even aware of. And these things are rules and norms and practices coming from the field, which have been unconsciously internalized in these translators' habitus, and they only come out in the form of decisions and choices. Another element in the structure of the field that you need to be aware of when you try to reconstruct the field is what he calls presupposed ideas or pre-assumptions. I've just mentioned them now. Things that producers of culture do without questioning them, or do without being aware of them, do without even talking about them, things that they take for granted. And these pre-assumptions are produced in the form of what Bourdieu calls doxic practices. Again, things that people are accustomed to. This is our way of doing things. One example of this is using singing in a theater translation in late 19th century Egypt, and well until the first decade of the 20th century. This was a doxic practice. Nobody questioned that. Even the very fact that these translations changed the plot structure, nobody questioned that. Titles of plays were changed. Even the names of the heroes and the heroines were changed. Radical Arabicization and Egyptianization of the plays were done without people raising any questions or using this kind of language like faithfulness, authorial intentions. These came later. We'll be talking about that now, towards the end of the first decade of the 20th century. In the field, you have orthodox plus heterodox ideas. Usually heterodox ideas and practices are brought into the field by the newcomers, a younger generation who would like to see a new way of doing things. The field has options, different alternatives that translators can choose from. In our case, for example, translating for the page, for reading, versus translating for the stage, or translating with a government publisher versus translating with a private publisher. All of these are options in the field that translators choose from. And I have to say that from my own experience, para-text, front covers, introductions, prefaces, blurbs are fundamentally useful in retrieving all of this information, are very useful in reactivating that field, bringing it to life. Just to give you one example, these are two front covers from two well-known translators. I admire them, the work of Professors Fatma Musa and Professor Muhammad Anani, two key translators, two canonized translators of Shakespeare into Arabic. But if you simply look at the front cover, you can find out what these translations are all about. You can retrieve an awful lot of translation. So, for example, if you look at the front cover of Professor Musa's version, which came out in its first edition in 1970, second edition 1997, what do we have here? A picture, a photograph of the well-known British theatre actor John Gielgud playing Lear, right? So that's an image, that's a picture of an actor on stage. When you look at the introduction of Professor Musa's version, you will find her talking about the fact that this translation was done for the stage. I have in mind actors and actresses pronouncing all of these wording and turns of phrases on the stage. If you look at the front cover of Professor Anani's translation, this is what you will have. An illustration, a beautiful illustration of the key characters in the play, done by one of the important illustrators of front covers in the history of Egyptian publishing, Gamal Utb. Some of you know that Gamal Utb used to draw the front covers of most of Naguib Mahfouz's work in its first editions. And if you look at the translation of Dr. Anani, the introduction and the linguistic choices, you will instantly see that the main aim of this version is to recreate a literary text. The literariness of the translation is at the center of this initiative here. So paratextuality is very important. A few words about field dynamics. We have mentioned that struggle between profit-oriented and prestige-oriented members of the field, struggle between established members and newcomers. The forms of capital do mutate across time. I want to say something additional about point number 3, which is the forms of homology, the kind of interrelationships between the field of drama translation and other fields. And again, this kind of relationship shapes and reshapes the field and the agency of translators. Just to give you one example. In 1920s, a few years before that, starting from 1913, 14, well until 1920, we can see from reading theater publications, theater magazines and periodicals at that time, we can see the rise of a new field, which we can call a field of theater criticism. A group of young people trying to reflect and comment and evaluate and advise theater makers in Egypt at that time. One of them is Muhammad Taimur. A very interesting series of articles that Muhammad Taimur published in 1920, before he died. A series of articles which he titled محاكمة مؤلفي الروايات التمثيلية, the trial of the playwrights. And this was published in Al-Sufur, Magalat Al-Sufur. And the whole series of articles is fictional. He imagines, he says that I'm going to share with you a dream. And this is what I saw in my dream. A trial, a court trial, in which all of the producers of theater, the playwrights, including translators, translators of canonical texts, all of them are brought to court. And the judges, the jurors are, and this is very, very interesting, and the discourse here is absolutely important. The jurors are a group of Western writers, including Shakespeare, Molière, Goethe, and others. All of them are Westerners, Western authors, judging these Egyptian translators and theater makers and telling them, asking them about what they have done with their own texts. Very interesting, quite telling. And we can see from the very language which is being used in this muhakama and this trial that the field of theater criticism will definitely have some impact on the output that we have in theater translation. Language like faithfulness, authorial intention, things like that start to emerge. One of the translators who was brought to trial in these articles is Khalil Mutran himself. And he starts talking about his work, trying to defend why he did what he did. Right, so this is what was happening in the earliest initiatives of translating Shakespeare's tragedies into Arabic in Egypt. People like Tanius Abdu trying to introduce a new artistic genre using artistic codes that Egyptian consumers of culture are aware of, using a language that they know, but at the same time trying to create a market for their products. So using elements from pop culture and using agents from pop culture was indispensable in this initiative, and this is what they do. Now, I want to take you to the second generation of translators of Shakespeare's work to see how the field is mutating and shaping around different forms of capital and different modes of agency. So starting from 1911, we see, and again, the paratexts are important here, we see different ways of talking about translation. We see basically a new generation of drama translators. And we know from historical biographical research that most of them are middle-class salaried employees. They don't rely on the money coming from a theater director like Salamah Ghazi to pay for them, but they are kind of financially independent. And this had a role to play in the shaping of the field. For these people, published drama translation becomes an option. At that time, small publishing houses started to mushroom in Cairo. And that's why publishing translation became an option. These translators had a challenge. They need to highlight the distinction of their own product vis-a-vis the work of the earliest generation of translators, people like Tanius Abdu. So we can see some tension on front covers, like this one, for example. I wonder if you can see that. I'm aware that the font size is small. But if you cannot see it, we have a gloss in English. And this is what happens on this front cover. That's a 1911 translation of Macbeth. And that's a back translation or a gloss of what is happening here on this front cover. And again, what is communicated by this translator and his publisher is quite telling about the change of the boundaries of the field, the change of practices. There are some elements which are maintained from the previous generation. Things like, for example, authored by Shakespeare, the greatest of the English poets, Ash'ar Shu'ara al-Inglis. Shakespeare was still at that point perceived as a poet, not as a playwright. The focus here is on poetry, language, rhetoric, figures of speech, images. Arabized in verse from the English language by Muhammad Iffat. And probably for the very first time, we see the word Arabized, ta'arib. And again here, the way this word was used by the early generation and the second generation, some of the members of the second generation was all about domesticating. For them, Arabization was all about adapting or domesticating or making intelligible that foreign piece of work. Revised in verse from the English language by Muhammad Iffat. We see new elements on this front cover. One of these new elements is the insistence of the translator to highlight the fact that he was translating from English. This is new. The first generation was not keen to talk about the source language they translated from. And historically, we know that they translated through French. People like Tanius Abdu, he did not read English. All of his output was through French. But Muhammad Iffat was keen to say that, well, my product is much better in quality than the work of the earliest generation because I translated directly from English. And then something very interesting is going on here about the audience. Our Arabization is dedicated to the whole world, including authors, poets, and scholars. But hold on. This is not the whole range of audience or readers I'm dedicating this piece of work to. It is specially dedicated to the honorable scholar and distinguished relative Tabuzada Hussein Rushdi Pasha, the foreign minister of the Egyptian government. So what is going on here? So it seems to me that we have some significant shift in the field here in terms of the kind of audience and consumers that these producers of translation reach out to. For the previous generation, the audience was lower middle class theater goers, Egyptian theater goers, who are not necessarily well educated, who are not necessarily aware of the writings of Shakespeare or Molière in their own source languages. But in this case, the case is different. The audience foreseen and targeted by these translators are kind of elite, well-educated, and they even take pride in highlighting the fact that they are connected with these people. They are producing something which is distinctive, which is different. It addresses and speaks to the well-educated people of the nation. Another example comes from a 1912 translation of Julius Caesar by Muhammad Iffat al-Qadi. Again, and again, the front cover, which I wasn't able to reproduce because it was totally worn out. The dedication on the front cover, this is what he had to say. This translation is dedicated to all nations aspiring to independence. Now, we didn't see this language before that. We've got something political, some political message being inserted and smuggled in this translation. When you turn over the front cover and look at the inside page, you have a picture of Shakespeare, and underneath it, you have this peculiar statement. William Shakespeare, الشاعر الروائي الإنجليزي, and so far this is okay. Al-Demokrati. So what has that to do with an Arabic translation of Julius Caesar in 1912? That's a very important question that a social historian like myself needs to ask. Well, this is, for me, this is how I read it. This is part of all of the endeavors of this generation to try to highlight the distinctive marks of their own product. The whole message here is our product is different from that product of the previous generation. We're not looking for making profit, for making money. We're not looking for sales. Our work is not about attracting money. It's all about educating people, addressing the well-educated people, or probably engaging with noble causes, noble political causes like the British occupation of Egypt at the time. Remember, this was in 1912, when Egypt was under British occupation. So it sounds as if that the translator wanted to distinguish and set apart his translation from the work of the previous generation and say something different about the function and the purpose of this translation. Now, that takes me to the second generation, and the case study that I have chosen to talk about the second generation is the well-known, the iconic translator of a number of Shakespeare's tragedies, and that is Khalil Mutran, himself not only a translator, but a poet, and also for a few years he was the manager of the National Theatre, Mudir al-Masrah al-Qawmi, for a few years. So he was aware of the intellectual and cultural scene in Egypt at that time. But again, if you look at his case, at this translation of Othello, you can see glimpses of the changes, the structural changes in the field of drama translation. And this is what I will talk about. And then after that, I will conclude. So that's my second and last case studies. What is of primary importance for me is not only the translation itself of Mutran, the linguistic choices and the rhetoric and everything, but the introduction. And this is one rare example of translators trying to produce a meta-discourse, talking and reflecting about their own work. We don't see any of that, I would say, before 1912, specifically before this translation. There might have been some translators in other areas than drama translation who have tried to reflect on their own work, but as far as I know, I haven't seen any translator trying to write an introduction and talk and say a few words about decisions taken in rendering their text. In Mautran's introduction, not a long one, short, but very valuable, he tries to justify using classical Arabic as the register of his translation. And when I say classical Arabic for Mautran, we're talking about that level, that very high level of modern standard Arabic, which goes back to pre-Islamic Arabic. Some of his language are even quite difficult to make sense of, even for modern speakers of Arabic. That's why if you look at the first editions, you'll find a lot of footnotes, himself trying to comment, trying to explain the meaning of these archaic words. So he chooses classical Arabic and he tries to justify his choice purely on political grounds. Again, using drama translation for purposes other than profit-making seems to be a central factor which shaped that field starting from 1911. I'll make a few quotations from this unique introduction, in which Khalil Mautran simply tries, and again, if you put this translation in its political context, again, Egypt was under British occupation, and some other parts of the Arab world were under colonialism, French, and the Levant, and so on and so forth. So what he was basically trying to say is that my choice of classical Arabic is purely political, and that's for the simple reason that at that time, in his time, 1912, he can't see any tool of countering and challenging Western colonialism other than the unity or the unification of all Arab nations. And for him, the only tool that can serve towards this unification is the use of classical Arabic by all Arabs. And he makes statements like this one. فَتَاللَّهِ لو ملكت العامية لقتلتها بلا أسف ولم أكن بقتلي إياها إلا منتقما لمجد فوق كل مجد منتقما لأمة كسرت العامية وحدتها. So we can see this this political underlying message in this introduction. It's unmistakably clear. And then he moves on in the same introduction, talking about his strategy. And he picks up the same words used by Muhammad Ifat al-Qadi, translator of Macbeth, when he talked about ta'rib. Another word, the same word was used by the early generation. And as I have mentioned, for them, ta'rib meant only domestication, adaptation, radically changing. But he tries to reshape, he tried to change the semantic input of that word. For him, ta'rib meant something else. And this is something we see obviously in this introduction. So he makes a statement like this one: I approach this play to Arabize it, وَعَرِّبُهَا, as if I were retrieving it into its origin. And again, he makes an assumption, a very daring assumption. He says basically that he believed that Shakespeare's Othello is not his own invention, is not his own creation, but he took the story from some other Arab source, whether in Arabic, he might have had access to Arabic, that's what Mautran says, or in translation. It's not his at the end of the day. And by translating this play into Arabic, I'm taking back what is originally mine. So the use of Arabization here is the connotations attached to the word are significantly different from simply talking about domestication or adaptation. So he simply shifts position between translation and original. Mautran's version becomes the original, and Shakespeare's text becomes the copy. Shakespeare copied the original, which is Mautran's. He's only taking it back. So he Arabizes and reclaims the name of the title hero, and he simply says that Shakespeare had deformed the original Arabic pronunciation of this Moorish hero, which must have been, and he came up with that pronunciation which we use until now, and that is Utail. He said that was the original pronunciation, that was the original name, and Shakespeare had anglicized it and deformed it, basically. So he Arabized the plot, he Arabized the name of the title hero, and he went a little bit further in his Arabization project. He Arabized Shakespeare himself. And that's another daring statement he makes in his introduction. إن في نفس شكسبير شيئا عربيا بلا منازعة ففي كل ما يكتبه شيء من روح البداوة قوامه الرجوع الدائم إلى الفطرة الحرة. In Shakespeare, there is definitely something of an Arab. In all he writes, in general, there is something Bedouin, something that anchors itself to the free, genuine human instinct. And we can see the political motivation driving this project of Arabization in the introduction and in the actual translation. I don't have much time to talk about all of the details, the lovely minute details of Mutran's translation, but I'll just mention a few things, especially in connection with the discourse of Othello, Utail. The kind of register, the kind of discourse that Utail uses in Mutran's version is peculiar and unique, especially if you compare it with the kind of registers used with other characters in the play. And of course, the plot of the play should help us a lot here. That's a play about ethnicity. That's a play about an encounter between a Moorish leader and members of the Venetian Senate. That's a play about that leader being accused of deceiving and luring Desdemona in order to marry him, a white woman with a black man. So there is a lot of tension going on here. And what's interesting is the kind of register that Mutran puts at the lips of Utail in order to distinguish him or give him the upper hand above members of the Venetian Senate, especially in Act 1, Scene 3. I'll just quote a few lines. For example, lines 87 to 90, this is what Othello says in Shakespeare's text, talking to members of the Senate who were trying to try him and judge him for the charge of seducing Desdemona in order to marry him. Othello says to them, "And little of this great world can I speak, more than pertains to feats of broil and battle, and little shall I grace my cause." He doesn't say anything about his linguistic capabilities. He doesn't make any comparison between how he speaks and how they speak. But this comparison, this tension between Othello, Utail, the way he speaks, which is for Mutran, needs to be lifted up above the registers of the other members of the Senate, is obvious, is unmistakably obvious in Mutran's wording. وفيما عدا وقائع الحرب والجلاد لا أجد شيئا ينطلق به لساني إلا اليسير من أحوال هذا العالم الواسع. فإذا دفعت عن نفسي فلا قبل لي، notice the following، فلا قبل لي بتحلية الدفاع ولا خشية عليكم من تأثير محسنات اللفظية. All of that is not in Shakespeare's text. Starting from Shakespeare talked about gracing my cause, تحلية الدفاع, possibly the possible equivalent here. But starting from ولا خشية عليكم, quite a condescending tone, if you like. ولا خشية عليكم من تأثير محسنات اللفظية. So this is the Moorish leader's tool of challenging these Western leaders. And that tool is language, the power of language, classical language. Another example, Othello talks to the members of the Senate, most potent, grave, and reverend seniors, my very noble and approved good masters. Translation, and that's interesting, and probably will not see the significance of Mautran's choice if we don't compare them with another version, interesting one. I wish I had the time to talk about these versions of one's translation in 1998, but here you go. In Mautran's version, يا أولي الاقتدار والرفعة والوقار سادتي الأمجاد. And notice what is missing, سادتي الأمجاد, my approved good masters. In Shakespeare, the tone is kind of slightly submissive. Othello is trying to put himself under these members of the Venetian Senate. It's not the case for Mautran. He is put up then. And that's why a word like approved masters doesn't show up for me. And even the word masters is translated in a very intelligent way, because in Arabic we have Sada wa Asyad, two plural forms of Sayyid. Asyad is kind of stronger. When you talk about Asyad, you're talking about masters in the strongest sense of the word, masters of slaves, of servants, and so on and so forth. But when you talk about Sada, we use that as some form of polite address terms, if you like. As-Sayyidat was Sada. He used that here. For Safwan, later in 1998, and that's a very interesting translation, again in terms of the identity politics, totally in contrast with the identity politics we have in Mautran's version. So Mautran says here, and here you can see the difference, Ya Ashab al-Amr, Safwan's is in Ammiya, Ya Ashab al-Amr والشان والمقام, يلي نبلوهم جعلني, notice that, يلي نبلوهم جعلني أرضاهم لنفسي أسياد. These little choices of words, these turn of phrases, it tells you something about the kind of identity that these translators would like to promote. Of course, if you read Safwan's introduction, which is also in Ammiya, and his translation, you can see that he's trying to counter Mautran's notion of pan-Arabism based on the use of classical Arabic, by promoting the idea of Egyptianness, Egyptian identity. And for that, he makes use of Egyptian Arabic. So Mautran's political agenda is centered on pan-Arabism, and this pan-Arabism is secular and inclusive. And that makes sense for somebody like him, coming from a Christian background, immigrating from the Levant to Egypt at the time, alongside many other Lebanese writers, journalists, translators, theater makers, a big generation that contributed significantly to the making of what we call Nahda, the 19th century Nahda in Egypt. So his version of pan-Arabism is secular and inclusive, and that affected his translation of ethnicities and religious terms in the translation. So he removed, for example, references to religions, heathen gods, the Christian oath, removing negative references to ethnicities. Just one example to show you. That's towards the end of the play, where Othello addresses Desdemona, are you a strumpet, a prostitute? No, as I am a Christian. That's in Shakespeare's version. And this becomes in Mautran's, لا والذي خلقني متقية. Not مسيحية or even نصرانية, but متقية. No religious identification of where she comes from. Again, ethnicities. In one place, the Duke addresses Othello and says, valiant Othello, we must straight employ you against the general enemy Ottoman as enemy. In Mautran's, يجب علينا يا عطيل الباسل أن نستعين بك عاجلا على عدو الوطن, without specifying who that adu is. And of course, we do understand that at the time, many Egyptians, especially in the Egyptian elite, did come from Turkish backgrounds, including somebody like Ahmed Shawqi. Right. And of course, you cannot make sense of all of that, what was happening in the field of drama translation in the second generation, without looking at the society at large. I've just mentioned that a significant wave of immigration of Lebanese theater makers and journalists who arrived to Egypt, Cairo and Alexandria in late 19th and stayed and lived in the 20th century. And all of them, they adopted the same discourse of secular pan-Arabism. Just to give you one example, one quote from one article by George Zidane that was published around that time, in which he talks about the same idea. Some might think that the purpose of the Arab unity is an Islamic unity, parallel to what existed during the apex of Islamic civilization, and that the aim of reviving the language is the strengthening of the Islamic element and the reestablishment of the Islamic empire. The Arabic unity has become something different from what it used to be, and these are the lines which I highlighted here. It comprises today all those who speak Arabic, regardless of the different denominations and religions. The goal at which we are aiming must be limited to the revival of the language, disregarding denominations. If anything else is intended, we will regress to the darkness of the Middle Ages. And at this point, let me conclude. I would like to go back to the picture we started with and say a few words by way of concluding this presentation. Back to the photograph of Tanius Abdu, the fact that I can see him without him seeing me, that I can narrate and construct his agency or habitus without him questioning my narrative, is itself revealing of a problematic that is not unrelated to our discussion of a sociological approach to translation or an alternative social history of it. It is true that Abdu, Mutran, and many other translators like them are historical agents that had their own objective existence in a field of objective relations. It is nonetheless true that the reconstruction of their agency in their respective fields of activity is itself conditioned by my historical position as a social historian. Bourdieu's self-reflexivity is one other tool that makes me aware of my own agency and my voice, which are part of the very fabric of this narrative I'm presenting you here. Of the Arabic translations of Shakespeare in Egypt. This reminder of my involvement in the reconstruction of this narrative is only enabled by a sociology that is keen to maintain the tension between the subjectivity of social agents and objective social reality, without excluding the subjectivity of the sociologist. Thank you. And I think I need to stop the sharing here, right? Yes.
Yeah, I guess so. Professor Sameh Hanna, I don't know how to thank you for this banquet. Really, it leaves us with so much to think about and want to discuss. I personally have a bucket full of questions for you, but because I'm fascinated by, the richness of the field in which you are engaged, whether it be Shakespeare and Shakespeare, but also, theater in Egypt and translators of Shakespeare, but also Bourdieu, and it's really quite enormous. But thank you for bringing it all together in a comprehensible and actually very compact way. I just want to tell our attendees that before we started the webinar, we decided that it might be best if people could please ask the questions on the chat box or the Q&A in writing, in Arabic or in English. so you can write in Arabic or you can write in English. We are also inviting you to take a 10-minute break because this has been a beautiful but quite long presentation. And I'm sure that some of you may want, a cup of coffee or some tea. And let's just all stay here. And in the meantime, give you time also to reflect on what questions you really want to ask so that they are important and not redundant. And it will give Professor Hanna time to actually review them as you send them in, and he will be able to see them, and so will I. And then, we can come back and pick up from where we left. So why don't we say, stay with us 10 minutes to just give Professor Hanna in particular breathing space after this fascinating presentation, but also for you to phrase your questions in such a way that they are questions, and whether in Arabic or in English, and then we'll come back. So it's now 8:25. We will come back at 8:35, and in the meantime, please send us your questions, and Professor Hanna will then have time to review them as they come in. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, really, for a brilliant presentation.
And apologies, it was longer than planned, but
no, but fascinating. I know that you had much more to say, and that thank you for. I'm sure you have a tremendous lot of passion for your topic, and you are very knowledgeable about all the fields that you have spoken to us about, and I'm sure it was not easy to sort of distill what you have to say in the time that you have used during this webinar. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You can see your questions, right? They're already coming in. Are you seeing them, or is it just me who can see them? In the Q&A, maybe it's just me who's seeing them.
No, I can see them, doctor.
All right, okay.
All panelists can see them.
All right, very well. Sameh, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Okay, maybe I can use I want to sort of use my power as host and begin the session with some general questions as we wait for more specific. I know you have congratulations from your audience who enjoyed this wonderful talk, but I'm curious actually as to our relationship as Arabs with Shakespeare. I mean, is this unique? I mean, why is it that the Arabs, and it's not just Egyptians, because we have translations from the region of, Shakespeare's dramatic works, but also of his poetry. And there seems to constantly be hyperbole in our relationship to Shakespeare. I mean, أعظم شاعر وأحسن مش عارف إيه etc. You have an explanation for that, since you've worked so much on Shakespeare's translations over a whole century?
Yes, I think our interest as Arab in Shakespeare is related to our interest in all of these canonical Western authors whose names and whose work have been used in the initiation and starting of new artistic products, if you like. So for things like theater, for example, things like novel as we know it in its Western definition, translation played an instrumental part in setting the boundaries of novel writing and theater making. So for me, from a sociological perspective, the interest is to a large extent pragmatic. I mean, the names of these canonical figures were used to persuade the would-be consumers of these cultural products of the respectability. We're not giving you something cheap. We're giving you a play by Shakespeare, by Molière, regardless of the fact that these translators have stayed close to the Shakespearean text or not. But the very name to be put on a front cover or in a theater poster guaranteed for these culture producers a minimum of success. So I'm trying to look at it from a purely pragmatic as a sociologist here. Of course, I can see some infatuation. I can see Shakespeare being used not only to set the boundaries of new genres, but to contest some existing cultural practices. Just to give you one example, there is a very well-known translation of Macbeth by Muhammad Farid Abu Hadid that came out in the 1950s. And if you look at the introduction of this translation, I mean, it's quite funny. What Muhammad Farid Abu Hadid was trying to do was to broaden and expand the boundaries, not of theater writing or theater making, but of poetry writing. Because he says that I have chosen blank verse in translating Macbeth, and I can see blank verse needs to take its chance in modern Arabic poetry, and I would encourage young writers and young translators to use that. So again, that would support my assumption that Shakespeare was used pragmatically. His work, his name, what he stands for was appropriated and reappropriated. And that's why we can talk about different Shakespeares, different Arab Egyptian Shakespeares, which have been fashioned and made and remade across time. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, absolutely. Let's go to, we have like 13 questions. You probably can see them.
Yes.
Which ones we want to begin with? There's a question from Mona Ale. Would you please give examples of meta discourse as clearly featured in Mutran's translation?
That's a very good question. I have referred to a couple of these of these themes, if you like, that came up in Mutran's introduction, talking about the use of classical Arabic and how classical Arabic is instrumental in achieving pan-Arab unification and so on and so forth. One other statement that he makes that has to do with his translation decisions, and again, this is funny, towards the very end, he makes these statements. لقد ترجمت, I'm trying to remember the wording, ترجمت هذا النص كلمة كلمة. This is a word-for-word translation. And of course, for all scholars, if you look at Mutran's translations of Shakespeare in general, and this particular translation, you will find out that he has lifted out whole scenes from the play. And from a sociological point of view, this tells me something. Not all that is said by translators about their work we need to take at face value. What they say in introductions, in interviews, and things like that, it needs to be critiqued and evaluated and put in the context of their field and their own work. So that's one example from Mutran's introduction.
Okay, we have another question. I mean, they're all long and very thoughtful, I think. This is from Farah Abdul Ghani. I love this presentation, but I have a question regarding your opinion on the current Egyptian scene of translation. It is of no doubt to myself that we strayed away from the idea of Pan-Arabism. So would you say that the translators are now more similar to Tanyus Abdu, willing to make profit and entertain as is prominent in the current pop culture? Or are they closer to the second generation, more willing to supply the well-educated and the elite?
That's a very tricky question. It's quite hard because simply I did not look at the contemporary scene, at the modern scene. My focus was to a large extent historical. But it's quite hard to give an either or answer. I think both and might be a more probable, reasonable answer. There is that strand of cultural production in general, including translation, which is quite interested in attracting a wider constituency of readers and spectators. And these producers of translation, they are after profit making. And there are others who are really trying to engage with political issues, cultural issues. There are many, many examples. For example, there is this one play, and a rewriting actually, of Hamlet under the title of Al Hamlet Summit. I wonder if you all remember this one, Qimmat Hamlet. And that performance, I think it was awarded the best performance in one of Cairo International Festival for Experimental Theatre. I don't remember the year now. So I think all of these do exist. We need a lot of work to try to map this field and describe what's going on, who are the key players, what forms of capital. So a conclusive answer to this question will be risky indeed.
Okay, thank you. There is a question, actually first a comment by Humphrey Davis, who congratulated you on your wonderful talk, but then has a question actually, because he is interested in book covers, as he says, and he says, it seems to me the two Othello covers could be read differently. The Gamal is a Gamal Qutb, that's what yes. You characterized as literary, but it mainly impresses me, Humphrey, with its kissing cousin relationship to movie posters of the time. Thus, entertainment might be what is signaled. The Gilgad cover evokes for me all that the Ida Gilgad.
The British actor that's on right. The cover of Fatma right. Musa's version.
Right. Yes. Acting of genius, high fidelity to the text also.
Yes, I totally agree. Thank you so much for your kind words, Humphrey Davis. I have a lot of respect for your work. Thank you for your comment. I agree with you regarding Gilgood's image on Fatma Musa's front cover. And that's in line, I think, with the translation brief that she followed. She was trying, and she says that, I think, in the introduction, she was trying to present a close Arabic rendering of Shakespeare's text. And she says something about the scholarship that she has done around Shakespeare's text, trying to understand them and try to persuade the reader that this translation is the outcome of academic scholarship. It's not done by an amateur translator. And this is what she tries to communicate and get across to us. That's a close version, a close theatrical version, stage version to Shakespeare's text. I'm not quite sure about Gamal Ob. What I know about him is that his covers were used for Mahfouz's work. And in that context, these covers have attached to them, because of their use with Mahfouz's work, they have got this ability of communicating some kind of literariness. That's a literary text. This language is literary. Not quite sure about the similarity with a film poster. I need to dig around that more.
Okay, if I may, follow up on this notion of entertainment, which I think is very important when we deal with Shakespeare and the kinds of decisions that translators have made, which language register they're going to translate Shakespeare into, or how they're going to sort of produce a Shakespeare play for a lay audience. And this understanding of Salam Mahgazi, for example, that Shakespeare is entertainment, at very early on in the 20th century. And that, gradually Shakespeare becomes sort of academic and stuffy, and, we need to translate him in, so it was okay to have dancing and singing initially, and then, we have to sort of try all of these translators who massacred Shakespeare, belittled him, made him popular, when actually Shakespeare is popular. So how do you explain this sort of stuffy relationship that we have with Shakespeare as his translators, Arabs? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Samia. Fascinating observation about that history. And I've always been saying that Shakespeare, in the early representations of his work in Egypt, he was part and parcel of pop culture. He was for everyone. People went to theater to watch representations of his plays, some of his ideas, probably not all of his ideas, but Shakespeare was made popular. He was part of this culture. What happened later, as I understand from history, is that starting from this second decade, 1920, the rise of this group of theater critics led by Muhammad Taimur, and then 1 decade later, we have the rise of another group of academics in English departments. Starting from the 1940s, people like Louise Howard, Fatma Musa, Muhammad Anali after that. All of these lovely people were sent into academic scholarships in the West, and they came back with a lot of capital attached to their name in the form of titles and studying in the West. And starting from the 1940s, I sense, we need to do more work around that. Shakespeare has been monopolized by academia. He was no longer part of pop culture, but no one starting from 1940s, and I think the one who started that was Louis Howard. No one dared to come close to Shakespeare and translate his work after the great Louis Howard started translating him. So again, it all boils down to these dynamics of the field. New agents coming in the 1940s, academics they kind of monopolized Shakespeare.
Okay, we have thank you. This is a great response to my my puzzlement. We have another question here. Thanks a lot from Talat Farouk. Thanks a lot for this rich and thought-provoking presentation. Don't you think that within the present post-211 spirit, we need to decanonize or at least deconstruct Shakespeare's racist discourse? By decanonizing, I mean translating modernist adaptations of his dramas, where, for example, dramas are performed by women-only cast, Othello performed by a white character, and Lady Macbeth by a black character.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it has already been done across time. I mean, if you look at the early decades of Egyptian cinema, most of the films that we know of are themselves adaptations of Shakespeare's work, are themselves deconstructionist readings of his work. But what you are suggesting here is absolutely important. And that's why it's important for us to think of Shakespeare's text as a space that we can abide, as a space that we can, I don't want to use the word occupy, to make use of the material there for our own agendas, our own concerns. This doesn't take from the fact that academics and students of English literature need to read Shakespeare's text on their own, but when it comes to facilitating a conversation between Shakespeare and our own culture, we need to pose to Shakespeare our own questions rather than taking his questions on us. We need to engage with him and ask his text our own questions about ethnicity, about race, about social class, and so on. Yes, I totally agree.
Okay, we have another question from an anonymous attendee. I wanted to ask whether there were methodologies you would suggest for keeping track of tendencies or doxic practices in the field in light of the enormity of translated content from and into Arabic these days.
Yes, that's a beautiful question. Yes, and probably it's coming from one who has experienced the fire of doing sociology. I totally agree with you. One of the big challenges of doing sociology à la Bourdieu of translations is retrieving biographical information about all of these agents and the alliances they engage with, alliances with publishers, proofreaders, editors. And in a country like Egypt, I have to say that I have experienced a lot of challenges trying to have access to the archive and retrieve all of these informations. Bureaucracy in itself can be an impediment here. But I totally agree with you. One method is, it's not a method, it's a suggestion. Trying to find out what translators say about themselves, and trying to see what they say about themselves vis-a-vis their own practices, and try to look at the agency of some other translators, because it will ultimately be deceptive if you end up reconstructing the habitus of a translator purely based on what the translator says about themselves. That can be quite deceptive, as you can see from the case of Moutran. You need to see how people received his work, how he or she did translation on the ground, and on that basis you can reconstruct their habitus.
Okay, we have a question in Arabic I'd like to take for us to respond to that, because we did tell people they can ask in Arabic and in English, and this is from Medna Hatim. هل حضرتك تعتقد أن الأفكار المتعلقة بالإخلاص في الترجمة وما إلى ذلك هي السبب في تراجع الاتجاه السائد لدى كتاب المسرح في القرون الماضية لخلق نصوص جديدة تماما تختلف عن النص الأصلي؟ أقصد نحن الآن لا نرى العديد من الأعمال الأدبية القديمة تعرب لتتيح نصوصا جديدة. قبل انتشار هذه الأفكار تمتع كتاب المسرح بفعل ذلك دون وجود أي اعتراض من الجمهور على ذلك.
ممتاز، رائع، شكرا يا ميرنا على السؤال. وسؤال يعني بيثير مشاكل وتحديات وأحيانا شجون. مسألة الإخلاص واللغة الخاصة بالأمانة والخيانة، مش عايز استبعدها بالكامل، يعني عايز اخليها بس تبقى موجودة في حدود الوظيفة بتاعة النص المترجم اللي المترجم بيرتقيها. يعني والمسألة هنا تتوقف على نوعية النص. يعني لو حد بيترجم نص قانوني أو نص معاهدة سياسية أو نص تقني، مسألة الأمانة هنا يعني مفروغ منها. يعني يجب أن يكون النص أمين بمعنى الاقتراب من تراكيب النص والخيارات واللفظية بشكل أو بآخر. لكن لما نتكلم في دائرة تتعلق بالفنون والآداب، الخيارات هنا متعددة. الخيار الخاص بمحاولة نقل النص بشكل أكاديمي لدراسته بشكل معين ده متاح. والخيار الآخر المتعلق ب الاشتباك مع النص، يعني محاولة إنتاج ترجمة تشتبك مع النص الأصلي وتحاول تطرح عليه أسئلة وتحاول تحط النص الأجنبي دوت في تربة جديدة وتخلق منها حاجة مختلفة. الخيارات دي أظن متاحة ومفهومة ومبررة. المسألة فقط بتعتمد على نوعية الجمهور أو القارئ أو المشاهدين في حالة المسرح اللي احنا بنتوجه إليهم بالترجمة.
Okay, this is an interesting question that I would have asked, but now it has been asked. Did you make a comparative analysis of Shakespeare's translations between Arabic and other target languages like French and Italian?
للأسف لا.
واسع جدا، سؤال واسع جدا.
بسبب يعني العجز الشديد. يعني أتمنى الواحد كان بيعرف أكتر من لغة.
Thank you for, the wealth of information analysis you provided us with. Here's another one from Hoda Abu Zaid, who also thanks you for a great lecture. I wanted to ask, why are such works considered translation? And as such, their content measured for distortion and sociopolitical deviation instead of taking them as adaptations, in which it would be normal to do such socio-political and naming transformations, the way we see in our old movies. It goes on. Is it for lack of more faithful translations at the time? So it would be sort of misrepresenting the original since it was the only ones in Arabic, etc. But yeah, I think it brings us back to things that you have already addressed. Yeah.
Yes. But that's again interesting, and here I'll have only to repeat myself and say, well, faithfulness is something important to be considered within specific limitations. If you talk about translating technical texts and so on and things like that, probably the discourse of faithfulness will fit in here. But if you talk about translating humanities, arts and culture and things like that, even when translators claim to be faithfully representing the text, we know it when we examine the translations. The very selection of specific vocabulary than others, the very selection of specific text for translation than others, itself shows that there is some degree of bias and interestedness.
Okay, we have a question from Professor Faria Ghazul, and the question is, when there is more than one translator of the same Shakespearean text, what is the relationship of the later translation to the earlier one? And she's citing the example of Anani and Musa. that you actually gave.
Yes, that's a beautiful translation. Thank you so much, Professor Mazul. And great to see you here with us. It's been ages. Well, your question is the very subject of a whole subfield of translation studies, which is the translation of retranslation, the retranslation phenomena. And that's a subfield which tries to raise questions like yours. Why is it the case that some source texts are retranslated more than once, and some others are do not receive any translation? Of course, we can explain that on different grounds. We can explain it in terms of different audiences, different translation briefs. We can explain it on the grounds of the different agency of the translators, where they come from, what kind of issues, what kind of preferences they have, and what they want to achieve with their own translation in the field. Usually people who have done some research on the sociology of retranslation, they talked about that tension between the later and the former. The later trying to displace and challenge and accrue some capital by claiming some distinction over the earlier version. And we have seen that in some cases. In some other cases, translators do not say anything about earlier translations. But we can see it in the introduction, in the footnotes, in the actual choices. We can see them trying to question and challenge and throw questions at earlier versions.
Okay, I think, we've probably exhausted you today, but I do want to ask one final question. And it has to do with what you just said about Shakespeare being part initially of popular culture, this understanding that Shakespeare is part of popular culture because he is that in his own culture, let's say, and that there was an interesting and brilliant understanding that this is what we should do with Shakespeare. We're gonna exploit him, but we're gonna place him where he was in his own indigenous culture. And this, as we saw, changes. And so I want to ask you, where do you stand on, Fusha and Ammiya translations of Shakespeare? How should we translate him? And I say should because there seems to be this very popular, strain and element in what Shakespeare represented in his own culture that we have sort of formalized to a point, as you said, where sometimes he's incomprehensible because we're using a language that really is not popular at all. So where do you stand on this?
That's a fascinating question. Yes, it's obviously very difficult for me, someone who has been doing descriptive translation studies, to try to answer a question about how should we translate. But but this has been a long-standing conflict in the field of translating Shakespeare about whether or not to use classical Arabic, and even if we agree on classical Arabic, what kind of register, because classical Arabic is quite varied and there are different levels of it. Well, for me, it's all about the audience, but you have made a very important point, probably under the influence of a second generation, people like George Abiad, Khalil Mutran, and then the influence of Muhammad Taimur as a theater critic. It seems that we have fashioned for ourselves an image of Shakespeare and his work that is kind of pedantic, bombastic, above time. Him and his work, they will teach us what to do with theater, and they stand detached from our own reality, which is not the case when we go back to Shakespeare's work. I mean, Shakespeare was originally an actor. Shakespeare was in the profession, to use the language of Tanya Saab, he was in the hirfa, he was hirafi. So his texts address themselves and lend themselves to our pop culture and our issues and questions in society, in politics, and we need to make use of that. We have made use of him We need to make more use of him in a language that the wider group of audience can understand.
I agree. I perfectly agree. Thank you so much for a really very enriching evening. There are more questions, but I guess you can respond to people in writing if they identify themselves to you by email. I think we covered as many questions as we could, and we'll have you back for more on Shakespeare.
With pleasure, with pleasure. Thank you so much, Sameh, for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for being with us. It's been really great.
Thanks so much. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Everybody, yeah. Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.